In the year 1990, a terrifying spree killer was on the loose in Canada. For almost a week, he held an entire country hostage and gave people nightmares. But at some point, it all had to come crashing to an end. This is the case of Peter John Peters. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also quietly playing the tambourine in the back of a cover band. Man, what would they ever do without me? But anyway, today we're going over the case of Peter John Peters, aka the Tattoo Man, a real-life monster who few people have ever heard of. Now imagine if an evil killer popped up out of nowhere and threatened to kill you if you didn't do what he said. For several people in today's story, that was a reality, and not all of them made it out alive. Albert Phillips was a hard-working family man who did generous things such as feeding the homeless. On the morning of Monday, January 22nd, 1990, the 63-year-old Albert was following his typical daily routine. He had woken up around 4 a.m., gotten ready for work, and then kissed his wife and 13-year-old daughter goodbye. After that, Albert got in his car and drove to the parking garage where he had been employed for many years. This was the same thing he did practically every day. But little did his family realize that was going to be the last time they were ever going to see him alive. Upon arriving at work, Albert parked in the garage, and after exiting his vehicle, he then proceeded to make his way to the little office inside. Albert clocked in at 4:44 a.m., but unbeknownst to him, lurking right around the corner was a demon in human disguise. Shortly after entering the office, the defenseless Albert found himself ambushed. Immediately, the lurking criminal had begun attacking him, and in a matter of minutes, Albert was beaten half to death with a metal pipe. It was so bad that Albert's dentures had been knocked out of his mouth while he himself was lying on the ground in a pool of blood. Just a few hours after that happened, a coworker found him barely breathing and contacted the police. But by the time Albert was transported to the hospital, it was already too late. Shortly after arriving, Albert Phillips was officially pronounced dead, and his family was notified of his tragic fate. He was 1 year away from retirement. Meanwhile, the killer responsible for it all was still on the loose. As it turns out, the man's name was Peter John Peters. Peters was a career fugitive with a long rap sheet and the eyes of an evil sadist. Growing up, he idolized figures such as cult leader Charles Manson and the outlaw Jesse James. Peters was known for his distinctive tattoos featuring a cobra on his left forearm, a large winged Pegasus on his back, and talons on his chest. In his hometown of London, Ontario, people even called him the Tattoo Man because of his habit of walking down the city streets without a shirt on in order to reveal his various tattoos. Now, it's important to note that at that time, tattoos weren't as common as they are now, hence why him having a few tattoos seemed like a big deal. Anyway, after killing poor old Albert, Peters, aka the Tattoo Man, had made his way to a parking lot of a bank in St. Catharines. While outside in his car, Peters saw a woman pull up next to him in her car and then get out to go inside of the bank. As the woman was heading in, she and Peters made direct eye contact, and in a purely friendly manner, they smiled at each other. The woman was named Sandy Bellows, and she was having as normal a day as they come. Sandy was 28 years old at the time, working for a telephone company. She had grown up in a very safe, trustworthy society where nothing bad ever happened. During this period in Canadian history, The country only experienced 500 homicides a year, which for a population of a little less than 28 million people was extremely low. So not long after Sandy entered the bank, finished her errands, and got back into her car, something unexpected happened. Suddenly, a man popped up from inside of her car, put a knife to her neck, and told her to shut up. Despite this, Sandy resisted vigorously. All of this was happening in broad daylight, and several onlookers were observing it, but none of them tried helping her. Meanwhile, Sandy was screaming and yelling to no avail. Soon, Peters had forced his way into the driver's seat, grabbed the wheel, and driven off. Thus was the beginning of a real-life nightmare. As Sandy sat riding in the passenger side of her own car, she was in a state of shock, but things were only going to get worse from here. At the same time as Sandy Bellows was being kidnapped, Albert Phillips' murder scene was being investigated by authorities. What they learned was that Albert's wallet had been emptied and his station wagon had been stolen from the garage. One of the pieces of evidence they uncovered was a knapsack hanging on a thermostat. Inside the knapsack were some bloody clothes. Strangely enough, this piece of evidence could be traced back to a woman who lived 60 miles away. The woman's name was Charlene Brittain, and she was a 25-year-old computer programmer. 3 weeks before her knapsack was found in the parking garage, Charlene had met a man on a train. The day was December 24th of 1989. The man seemed reasonably charming and nice enough, so she gave him a shot. She described him to her sister as a long-haired, handsome guy with tattoos. Before long, Charlene and this man went on a date together at a restaurant. At this date, however, her impression of him started to change. She found him to be touchy and controlling and was uncomfortable with the fact that he had previously spent time in prison. So following the date, she no longer wanted to be in contact with him. But 3 weeks later, something strange happened. Charlene suddenly went missing under mysterious circumstances. As the days went by without any sign of Charlene, her sister, whose name was Darlene, decided to do an investigation of her own. After Darlene visited her sister's apartment, she discovered a note in a basket that had the name and address of Peter John Peters. With this information, Darlene soon visited Peter's apartment where, with permission from the landlord, she was allowed inside. But upon entering Peter John Peters' basement apartment, Darlene made a shocking and gruesome discovery. Inside the place was a trail of blood leading to the dead body of her sister, Charlene. As Sandy Bellows was being taken hostage in her own car, she sat in the passenger seat in a state of shock. Shortly after the criminal next to her had forced his way into becoming the driver, he had told her that he wasn't going to hurt her and that he just needed the car. He also said he needed her to look like his wife, and only if she cooperated, everything would work out. But as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that Peter John Peters was not a man of his word. Sandy noticed his driving was extremely erratic and repeatedly insisted that she talk to him. Whenever he went silent, it felt like a death sentence to her. But overall, Peters appeared very paranoid and jittery. According to Sandy, she couldn't help but feel a sense of disgust by the stench coming off of him. More specifically, his body smelled rotten and had the stench of death attached to it. Before long, however, Peter had gotten off the highway and told Sandy he was looking for a place to drop her off. During this brief period, Sandy almost felt like she could breathe a sigh of relief. When Peters had picked a location on a back road somewhere, he slowed down a bit and gave her the impression he was going to stick to his word. But instead of stopping, he appeared to change his mind at the last minute. Quickly, he sped up and continued driving while Sandy felt her sense of fear and hopelessness return. After a period of time, Peters drove the two of them to a dirt road surrounded by a bunch of trees. As the two of them were sitting in the car in the middle of the woods, Peter suddenly changed his demeanor. While before this, he wasn't exactly acting pleasant, now he became downright evil. He soon held a carpenter's awl to Sandy's throat and began demanding that she undress herself. Out of fear for her own life, Sandy complied with Peters' demands. After that, Peters took advantage of her, and according to Sandy, it was at this moment she knew that he had no plans to keep her alive. Suddenly, to Sandy's surprise, however, Peters stopped doing everything he was doing. As it turned out, a man was slowly coming up the dirt road on a tractor. Quickly, Peters began to panic. He told Sandy someone was coming up the road and to, quote-unquote, not do anything stupid. Next, Peters slowly exited the car from the back right passenger side door. Meanwhile, as he did this, Sandy took advantage of the opportunity and escaped from the vehicle herself. Then she began running for her life. Right away, Peters also began running in an attempt to catch up with her. Before long, he did, and right in front of the man coming up on the tractor, he attacked Sandy viciously. While on top of her, he stabbed her multiple times with a screwdriver and knocked her unconscious. As he was doing this, though, the man on the tractor hopped off and started running towards the scene of the crime. As it turns out, the man, whose full name was Al Pike, was a retired police officer. Throughout his career, Al had dealt with a lot of violent, dangerous altercations, and without hesitation, his muscle memory reactivated. When Al started running after Peters with an axe, Peter quickly got up and sprinted towards the safety of his stolen car. Meanwhile, Al continued to chase him down. And when Peters had finally made his way to the car, Al was right there behind him. Soon, Peters had hopped in, begun driving, and attempted to get out of Dodge. But Al wasn't going to make it easy for Peters. As Peters began driving, Al broke the back rear passenger window with his axe and jumped halfway in. Then he attempted to hit Peters with his axe. Ultimately, though, as the car sped up, Al lost his balance and fell out of the vehicle without even touching as much of a hair on Peters' head. He did manage to stop the bloodshed, however, and that was what counted. But after falling out of the car and picking himself up from the dirt, Al quickly ran back to help Sandy out. By this point, Sandy had experienced a complete and total nightmare. Unbeknownst to Peters, however, he had done a terrible job of trying to kill her. Sandy was impressively resilient, and her physical injuries weren't as bad as they looked. After going over to her, Al helped lift her up on his tractor, and together they rode back to Al's son's house. Then Al and family called an ambulance, and Sandy waited for a bit. When the ambulance arrived, however, she refused to get in. As it turned out, one of the paramedics had a striking resemblance to Peters. At that moment, Sandy was absolutely petrified. And then yet again, when she finally arrived at the hospital, she saw someone she thought looked like Peters. From this point onward, everywhere Sandy looked, she saw Peter John Peters. She felt his presence everywhere. It was as if there was no escaping him until he was caught. But in the meantime, as she was recovering, every police authority in the nearby area and practically all of North America had been notified to look out for Peters. They had identified him via a fingerprint he left in Albert Phillips' car. Before long, the search for Peter John Peters became the largest manhunt in the history of Ontario. The media was covering it end to end, and it seemed like everybody and their mother was keeping their eyes peeled and looking out for a single individual. Shortly after escaping from Al Pike, Peters had made his way to a home in Brant, Ontario. It was here that he broke in and threatened an old woman with murder if she didn't hand over her car keys. After the woman gave him the keys, he then stole her car and took off. Next, Peters drove to a bank in Paris, Ontario. After parking, he got out, made his way inside, and began threatening the tellers to hand over all the money they could give him. The tellers complied, and Peters left with a duffel bag of cash like a wannabe Jesse James. Then he made his way back on the road. His next destination was a little place known as Chatham, Kent. Here in Chatham, Peters quickly got to work on his next potential victim. While driving through a residential suburban-type area, he saw a young woman at the end of her driveway. The girl was 15 years old, and Peter rolled down his window and tried to coerce her into hopping into the vehicle. Fortunately, the girl was smart, though. Quickly, she ran up the driveway as fast as she could and got the heck out of there. Shortly thereafter, Peters then dropped into a Tim Hortons restaurant and got a large coffee and chocolate milk to go. Following this, he then made his way to a strip club in a failed attempt to track down an ex-girlfriend. But before long, when he was done here in Chatham, Peters soon ditched the car he was driving and he hopped on a bus. The bus ended up taking him to the city of Sault Ste. Marie. By the point that Peters had disembarked from the bus, he was clean-shaven with a short haircut. Not long after getting off of the bus, he attempted to lure another victim within just a few feet of where he arrived. In an area near the bus stop, Peters came into contact with a woman who was clearing snow off of her car. After approaching her, he demanded that she get into the car, telling her he would kill her if she didn't. But she refused and ran away, and he stole her car anyway. The same woman then made her way to a local police station, wherein which she told the authorities about her encounter with Peters. Soon, every police officer in the nearby area was given the order to join in the hunt for this dangerous individual, and they searched every road imaginable. Meanwhile, Peters continued his reign of terror with his newly stolen car. Before long, the car ended up getting stuck on a slippery hill, and yet again, he had to abandon another vehicle. Next, Peters made his way to a nearby farmhouse where he broke in through the front door. Inside was a 19-year-old man casually watching TV. His name was Bob Johnston. Peters ran up to Bob, threatened him with a knife, and forced him to load up, then hand over a shotgun. When Bob did this, Peters took a look outside through the open window, only to see a bunch of white hat workers surrounding the car he had abandoned. These men were evidently from the local electricity board. Quickly, Peters lifted up the shotgun and took aim at the crew. Fortunately, however, Bob was able to talk Peters out of killing the workers, shouting, "Well, they didn't do anything to you, so there's no need to kill them." But in exchange for not killing the workers, Peters had Bob help him find a new car. At this point, Bob was still afraid for his life. But together, Peters and Bob soon made their way to a neighbor's house. As they were quickly walking up the driveway, the neighbor, who was a parishioner named Ernie, saw the pair from the sliding glass door at the corner of his eye. At the time, Ernie had a guest over who was a preacher. While Ernie and the preacher were engaging in light conversation, Peters and Bob broke into the home through the sliding glass door. Immediately, Ernie and the preacher were shocked, and Bob told them that it was best if they just did whatever Peters said. Peters demanded to know whose car it was that was sitting outside. When he didn't receive a quick enough response, he started shouting and raised the gun at Ernie and the preacher. Ernie was fully convinced at this point that he was going to die. Not only did Peters want the car, but he didn't trust that the preacher was actually a preacher. He kept accusing him of being a cop. But soon the preacher showed Peters his ID and handed over the keys to his car. Then Peters walked into a nearby room and tore Ernie's house phone off the wall. Afterwards, Peter then exited the house, hopped into the preacher's car, and drove off. A very familiar pattern at this point, and yet another example of GTA. Unfortunately for the fugitive, though, the car he was using soon got stuck in the snow, and he had to ditch it and continue on foot again. After breaking into yet another woman's house and stealing another car, this time a Ford Tempo, his reign of terror was finally about to come to an end. On January 25th of 1990, 5 days into Peter's rampage, police closed off all the nearby roads and set up a roadblock about 40 kilometers outside of Sault Ste. Marie. Upon reaching the roadblock, Peters skidded to a halt in his stolen Ford Tempo. After that, he paused momentarily before getting out of the vehicle. Meanwhile, the many police who were standing behind their vehicles set their sights on the Ford Tempo and prepared themselves for whatever was about to happen. But unexpectedly, Peters soon got out of the vehicle with his hands up and allowed the police to take him into custody. Finally, after 5 days of terror, 2 people dead, 1 injured, and several others taken hostage, the rampage of Peter John Peters was over. Within a matter of time, Peter's trial commenced, and with help from people like Sandy Bellows and Charlene Brittain, Peter John Peters was officially sentenced to 3 life sentences in prison. Many years after her terrifying but miraculous story of survival, Sandy Bellows turned her experience into an impressive comeback. She later went public with her experience and became an advocate for victims of sex. And eventually, she even wound up winning a seat on her local city council. As for Sandy's relationship with Al Pike, the man who saved her, well, he became a very close family friend, and as Sandy got married and had kids, he attended practically every birthday party and event. Al ultimately died in 2016 at the age of 90, and unfortunately, as recently as a few years ago in 2021, Sandy herself ended up passing away due to cancer. But unlike how she could have died so many years ago, by the hands of a stranger and in a random part of the woods, Sandy died peacefully in a hospice bed surrounded by her family. So rest in peace to Sandy. Also, rest in peace to Albert Phillips and Charlene Brittain. Albert left behind a wife and a teen daughter, while Charlene left behind many people that loved her, including her sister. Each were 2 unfortunate victims of circumstance. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the third one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the second one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.